Pierre, the son who chooses to travel instead of his father, discovers a painful truth. He has always loved to travel, but his search for freedom has distanced him from his own family. Subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Pierre, the son who chooses to travel instead of his father, did not hesitate. He decided to go ahead with the trip. He ignored his father's critical state, as if it were a way to avoid facing the reality that his life was about to be turned upside down. Traveling, although it seemed like a simple escape from everyday life, had a different aura. Pierre always felt a strange sensation, as if something was about to happen, but he could never identify what. Pierre was a young middle-class man, the son of a couple of successful lawyers, Antony and Priscilla. He grew up in a spacious house, surrounded by his two brothers and a sister, with a small age difference between them. His childhood was marked by many activities and moments of fun, but always shadowed by a certain emotional emptiness. His parents, although loving, were often absent, immersed in their professional commitments. This left Pierre and his siblings in the care of Sonia, the nanny, a loving woman but with a mysterious presence, who sometimes seemed more like a guardian than a mere caregiver. Despite his parents' constant absence, Pierre felt loved. He and his siblings were spoiled with gifts and outings. On weekends, when the lawyers managed to escape work, the family would get together and travel to some destination. These moments of leisure were what Pierre looked forward to the most. He would look forward to Friday, when, after school, the adventure would begin. But there was something more to the outings. Something that he would only understand much later. Pierre always felt a strange sensation, as if something was about to happen, and no matter how much fun he had, a shadow hung over the happy days, an inexplicable feeling that it was not just fun that his parents sought during these periods. But at that time, Pierre's concerns were just unanswered doubts. He loved these trips and believed that they were the ultimate expression of his parents' love. In the destinations, always well planned by Antonio and Priscilla, Pierre and his brothers were the protagonists of the story, always receiving attention, always being the center of attention. However, a strange feeling of something incomplete accompanied him on each trip. Sometimes Sonia, who had been with the family for many years, would look at him penetratingly, as if she knew more than she was saying. He noticed this, but could never bring himself to ask. It was as if she knew a secret that he shouldn't know. Pierre never questioned the trips, because there was always something magical about them, but something that bothered him. The feeling that his family, despite everything, didn't fulfill him, as if something was missing as he approached adolescence. His brothers seemed calmer, more adapted to the lifestyle, but Pierre couldn't shake the feeling that something was unfolding, something that he didn't yet understand. And then something happened. One day, after a walk in a small mountain town, Pierre had a strange nightmare. He woke up in the middle of the night, in a cold sweat, with a vivid image in his mind. He saw his parents arguing in a distant place, a silent argument, with quick gestures and tense looks. Pierre didn't know what it meant, but the feeling of unease persisted. He tried to convince himself that it was just a nightmare, one of those confusing images that arise in a moment of rest, But a part of him knew there was something more, because in the dream, he was the pivot of the argument. Over the years, Pierre continued to grow up with the feeling that his life was not completely clear. His parents, despite being loving, never seemed completely present. And Sonia, always so attentive, but with a distant look, seemed to be hiding something. But Pierre didn't dare ask. Maybe it was his youth that still prevented him from understanding the subtleties of human behavior, or maybe it was the fear of the unknown. Time passed, and the travels continued. Pierre was becoming more and more a young man eager for adventures and life's mysteries. But something inside him made him question what really happened behind closed doors. He didn't know it, but soon the truth would begin to reveal itself in a way he could never have imagined. The inheritance left by his grandfather to his grandchildren, Antony's father, who was already advanced in age, would be the fuel for the events to take place. As Pierre grew older, he became increasingly absorbed by his passion for travel. Those weekend getaways that had been so exciting in his childhood now became an addiction, a constant need to escape from routine, from home, from the city, and, above all, from the responsibility of being with his family. The memories of his travels were still present in his mind, but now there was a growing pressure inside him, the feeling that the world outside, distant and unknown, was more appealing than the family relationships that he was beginning to perceive as heavy and restrictive. Pierre was in his adolescence, a phase of discovery but also of escape. He began to distance himself more and more from his brothers, who seemed more concerned with school and daily activities, and especially from his parents. Antony and Priscilla, no matter how much they tried to be present, seemed increasingly distant. Deep down, Pierre felt that his parents were more concerned with their careers than with him and his brothers. And Sonia, the nanny, who until then had been a constant and mysterious presence, seemed more and more like a ghost from the past, silently observing everything. She still looked at Pierre in a different way, but he could no longer see the signs she was missing. It was during this period of distance that Pierre began to focus entirely on traveling with his friends. He planned his getaways with the same anxiety with which he prepared for an exam, as if it were the only thing truly worthwhile in his life. It was more than leisure. It was his way of escaping, the place where he felt he could breathe freely. The trips became more frequent, longer and more intense. During one summer, for example, he would go away for weeks, exploring different countries with his friends, leaving his family behind, as if he were no longer part of that world. His worldview was increasingly restricted to these moments of leisure and adventure. He became more withdrawn, more immersed in his own pursuits and desires. The family ties, which had previously been solid, began to slowly fray. When he was home, he always seemed in a hurry to leave, to go away, to go on another journey. It was as if he were trying to escape from something, but he himself didn't know exactly what. The tension in the family was increasing. Antony and Priscilla, no matter how hard they tried, could not get Pierre to take an interest in family life again. Dinners became increasingly silent, and family moments, which used to be full of laughter and conversation, were now punctuated only by looks of frustration. and they wondered how Pierre had developed that personality without them noticing. Pierre, in turn, seemed not to realize the impact of his behavior, or perhaps he was trying to avoid realizing it. He only felt good when he was away, exploring new landscapes and challenging himself to live intense and ephemeral experiences. And then something happened that, without Pierre knowing, would change everything. Antony fell ill. At first, it seemed like just a common flu, but soon the situation worsened. The fever wouldn't go away, and the shortness of breath indicated something more serious. When the doctor finally gave the diagnosis, the news was devastating. Antonio would need to be admitted to the ICU. The family was in shock. Priscilla, desperate, tried to contact Pierre, but he was traveling with friends. He had heard about his father's illness, but the news wasn't enough to make him rethink his plans. The trip was already scheduled, and he felt tied to a commitment with his friends, as if the trip was the only thing that really mattered at that moment. He knew his parents needed him, but he kept moving further away. His worldview was clouded by a fog of selfishness and escape, and he chose to ignore the silent cries of his family and think only of himself. While he distanced himself even further, his worried siblings were with their mother, trying to deal with the gravity of the situation. All the family members expected Pierre to be there, by their side, offering support, but he preferred the company of his friends and the promise of new adventures. His decision caused great discomfort throughout the family, but no one knew how to confront him. Tension spread throughout the house, and the silence became even heavier. Over time, Antony's health began to improve, but Pierre was not around to witness his recovery. He continued to immerse himself in his travels, increasingly distant, as if he were living in a parallel world where reality could not reach him. And while his family got back on its feet, Pierre found himself on a road that was taking him away not only physically, but emotionally. But something, unknown to him, was about to happen. Something that would finally make him face the truth. What Pierre didn't know was that his choices would bring him to a breaking point, a point where he could no longer run away from his responsibilities and the bonds he had neglected. The next chapter of his life would begin to unfold with a force he could not control. Time continued to pass, and Pierre, increasingly immersed in his travels, began to feel a growing emptiness. What had once seemed like a search for freedom now revealed itself as an attempt to escape himself. The separation from his family, initially something he saw as freedom, soon became an emotional prison. He didn't know it, but he was losing himself. The feeling of discomfort and restlessness that had always been there now consumed him completely. He found himself increasingly lost, further removed, not only from his family, but from who he truly was. Meanwhile, Antony's recovery was slow but steady. Although the serious illness had left scars, he was determined to take care of himself so that he could still see his children grow up and reconcile with Pierre. However, despite everything that had happened, Antony never showed anger or resentment for his absence. The true reason for his illness was still hidden, something that Pierre had never known. It was on a quiet afternoon, months after Antony's recovery, that Pierre, after a disagreement with a friend, decided to return home. He felt an almost desperate need to return, something that pulled him back to where he had always belonged, even though he had strayed so far. When he arrived, the house was quiet, as usual, but there was something in the air that seemed different. But he was carrying a crisis of conscience for being the son who chose to travel instead of following his father's illness. Antony was sitting on the porch, enjoying the afternoon sun, watching the horizon with a serene expression. When Pierre approached, the two stared at each other for a moment. There was no need to say much. Pierre sat next to his father, feeling the stillness that hung between them. It was Antony who broke the silence. "Pierre, you know what made me sick, don't you?" he said, without taking his eyes off the horizon. Pierre, surprised, looked at him, confused. "What do you mean, Dad?" "The doctor said it was a serious infection." Antony looked at his son with a sad smile. "No, Pierre. My illness wasn't just physical. I got sicker over the years as I saw you moving away. The pain wasn't just in my body, but in the distance you created between us. I knew you didn't want to see it. I knew you were running away, but that hurt me more than any physical illness. And that's what made me sick." Pierre remained silent, feeling the weight of those words. He had never understood that his father's pain was not just physical, but emotional. The trips he loved so much, the constant escape from reality and his family, had contributed to the deterioration of their relationship. He never knew that his absence had such a profound impact, that his quest for freedom was destroying the family's harmony. Antony continued, his voice soft but full of truth. "I have forgiven you, Pierre. I have forgiven you from the moment you walked away. But not for me. For you. Because I knew that at some point you would realize what you were doing. And today you came back. I expected you to come back to understand." Pierre, now remorseful, and with a heavy heart, felt overcome with guilt. What had he done? How had he not realized what was happening while he was drowning in his travels? He felt that something had been stolen from his life, and that things would never be the same. But as he looked at his father, something changed inside him. Antony's forgiveness did not come from a place of weakness, but from immeasurable strength. He understood, in that moment, that true freedom lay in connection, in unconditional love, not in running away from what was difficult to face. Pierre stood up and, with a choked voice, said, "I'm sorry, Dad. I didn't know how much I was hurting you. I was selfish. I only thought about myself, about my adventures, and I forgot about those who really matter. But now, I see how much family is what really matters." In his thoughts, he remembered the Nani's piercing looks at him. It was as if she knew how much his unloving attitudes would cause suffering. Antonio smiled, his eyes full of wisdom. "I know, my son, and that's why I'm here to support you, to help you find your way again. Don't blame yourself. Just learn from it. Life is made of mistakes and learning." Pierre, with the support of his father, began to recover, not only physically, but emotionally. He reflected on his life, on the mistakes he had made, and on the choices he could still make. He knew that the path ahead would not be easy, but he was ready to start rebuilding his life. He resumed living with his brothers and Priscilla, and over time, the barriers he had created began to crumble. Pierre married someone who supported him and understood his scars. He became a responsible man, not only in his actions, but also in the care and love he showed for his family. The lesson he learned was profound. True value lay in human connection, in love and mutual respect. Over time, all the disagreements were overcome. The bond that had been weakened was restored, stronger than ever. The family, now united, looked to the future with hope. Pierre knew that the journey would not be perfect, but he was ready to face everything alongside those he loved most. And so, the suspense that had marked his life now dissipated, giving way to a new chapter, full of love, redemption, and the true freedom that he had finally found. If you also value good principles, leave your comment, subscribe to the channel, and share. Together, we can build a life of excellence, guided by behaviors based on principles and values that really make a difference.